The Witcher. I'd been reviewing season 3, but I've jumped back to review the first ever episode, and this is part 2 of that, so you may want to start with part 1 if you haven't watched it yet. Cosplay time again, I guess, and here we have the character Ciri as she was in the later games, pretty much as described in the book with ash grey hair, and here is a pretty fair cosplay attempt again. Now compare that to the show, and they couldn't even get her hair colour right. The entire female line of Ciri's family are supposed to have ash grey silver hair. Ciri, her mother and her grandmother, and in the show none of them have. Ciri and her mother were blonde and the grandmother had dark hair, and it's like the show does it on purpose. This may seem like a small thing, but consider how this is used in Game of Thrones. A lot of the time you can tell what house someone is from just by their features, their clothes, their accents. It's all part of the world building. In episode 1 there's a mage called Stregobor with a frankly impeccable sense of decor, and his mortal enemy, a princess turned outlaw called Renfri. Stregobor has sealed himself inside the tower for safety from Renfri and her gang that has a beautiful garden in it with fruit trees and a fountain and nice stone archways, and oh yeah, there are a load of pleasantly shaped women picking fruit with no clothes on, and I can show none of that on YouTube, which goes to show you how the series has changed from season 1 to season 3. Because in contrast there is no part from Witcher season 3 that I couldn't clip and put on YouTube, but there's an awful lot like this scene from season 1 that I can show very little to none of. Don't ask me why. To me this scene is beautiful and I'd happily show it. It's Google and YouTube's rules. On YouTube I can show a woman getting a knife in the chest as long as there are clothes covering the chest at the time. If there weren't, the lack of clothes would be the part that got me in trouble with YouTube. I even have to be careful of the terms I use to describe a human with no clothes on. The word for the pointy structures on people's chests is on demonetisation lists, so no jokes about that for me I guess. Terminal violence on YouTube is apparently fine, people existing without clothes on, not fine. And frankly, in his position, even if Renfri wasn't there I wouldn't leave that tower. Did you see them pomegranates? And no, that's not a euphemism. And they're in a standoff. Renfri has been chasing Stregobor for how he wronged her in the past, and Stregobor is hiding in the Tower of Eternal Wonder where Renfri can't get in, and both of them want Geralt to get rid of the other for them, arguing that it's the lesser of two evils. Though maybe the town needs a banana or two in there, it's starting to get like the cast from the series Ahsoka. Sadly the Geralt storyline in the show is cut in with the story of Ciri in Sintra that happens 33 years later, and I just kind of find it a drag on Geralt's story. Geralt's story was a standalone in the book, but now suddenly we're in another country 33 years later and the story doesn't even tell us. And we're doing this because the show wanted more female representation, and they also wanted to turn The Witcher into Game of Thrones. Writing something like Game of Thrones is not easy. If it was, anyone would do it. I'm not sure I could write something of that quality, and it doesn't appear George R.R. Martin can even finish the story to his satisfaction, never mind trying to take The Witcher source material and remake it into Game of Thrones. It would maybe be easier to start with a completely blank slate, because if you're trying to turn this into Game of Thrones you will have to break from the source material a lot. Ciri is a princess in Sintra. Her grandmother Calanthe is the queen, living with her second husband, Iced.
Grant me leave, my queen. I'm worn from my trip to the Isles. And my bedchamber duties before that.
Gross.
And this is a fantasy medieval series. People shouldn't be using words like gross or wasted. So that thing that I didn't like in season 3, that they were using modern language that didn't fit a medieval fantasy, well, they were doing that all the way back in episode 1 of season 1. I just let it go at the time because Henry Cavill was good and on screen, I liked the characters and the story was interesting enough, and there was a garden full of shapely women with no clothes on. Calanthe also seems much changed from the books. I can't find any of this Ciri part in the first book. Maybe it's taken from a later book that I haven't got to yet. But Book Calanthe seems more devious and less warrior-like in the book. There seems to be this obsession that all women have to be warriors in modern series. I don't get it. Why do you need to give Yennefer a sword? She can throw fireballs. And it's the same with Galadriel and Rings of Power. We have more Geralt parts and then we cut back to Sintra, and I have no idea how much time is supposed to have elapsed. It could be the same day, it could be months later, but in Sintra, trouble is brewing. We have the character Iced say,
I saw the wraiths of Moorhawk over the channel this morning.
Yes, you mentioned, eh?
No good will come of it. They're an omen of war.
and they just drop that line in with none of the context that the audience would need to understand it. And they were doing this all the way back in the first ever episode. Dropping terms in dry that would be absolutely meaningless to anyone that hadn't read the books. Firstly, the channel is here. Sintra and the Skellige Isles are allied by marriage, and the Wraiths of Moorhog, they're talking about the spectral riders of the Wild Hunt, before they've even introduced the concept to the audience, and there's just no setup here. Ideally, this would have been in an earlier scene. Maybe have Ciri ask Iced what the Wild Hunt is and have him explain it. Bare minimum, you could have had her ask in this scene. That would be traditional because it will let the audience know what the hell you're talking about. The Sintrans are worried that Nilfgaard, their much larger southern neighbour, is going to attack them, and in this conversation we learn that the Nilfgaardian forces have crossed the border, and this is all happening far too soon in the show for me. In the first episode, these characters have barely been introduced. The Sintrans ride out to meet the Nilfgaardian army instead of waiting for their allies that never arrived due to bad weather or making use of their massive castle. The Sintrans lose and their castle falls, all in the first episode, and it lacks impact because we barely got to spend any time with the characters that we're losing. What happened to Ned Stark in Game of Thrones had impact because of the time the audience got to spend with him. Otherwise, it's just Sean Bean wearing bits he cut off for Wolf. The Fall of Sintra should not have really been an episode 1 thing in the show. It would have had far more impact if we'd got to know the people of Sintra. And if they were going to go for Game of Thrones, we kind of needed to know the people of Nilfgaard too. As Sintra is falling, Ciri's grandmother tells her to go and find Geralt, and she ends up fleeing from the city alone. Meanwhile, back in Blaviken, Geralt is about to get a visit from Renfri. In the book, he's in a room, and when he gets back, she's in it, having climbed across the rooftops to get there. In the show, she just approaches him in a clearing. Either way, she tells him her story, of her stepmother and Stregobor trying to end her life, and the things she had to do to survive. Geralt thinks he's convinced her to leave peacefully, and they go to bed together. Renfri, it turns out, is very manipulative, and from here on, I kind of prefer what the book did. Geralt cannot confront Renfri directly because she has the protection of the region's king, and in Geralt's room, Renfri had mentioned something called the Tridem Ultimatum. At the time, Geralt did not know what this meant. In the book, Geralt then goes to see the Alderman to tell him that he thinks he's managed to solve the conflict peacefully, and the Alderman tells him of some of Renfri and her gang's exploits. 3 years before, the most notorious story about them had happened. The Baron of Tridem was holding some of their outlaw friends and wouldn't let them free. So Renfri and her group executed civilians until he did, and that's when Geralt knew. He knew what Renfri intended to do. Renfri intended to do the same to Stregobor that she'd done to the Baron of Tridem. She planned to execute civilians until Stregobor was forced to leave the tower. In the book, that is how Geralt knew to go to the town square and what Renfri intended to do there. In the show, he just knew. And they couldn't do this part because they'd given all of the Alderman's lines to his teenage daughter for reasons. From there, the show and series play out much the same. Geralt goes to the town square to confront Renfri and her gang and stop them executing civilians. With one big change at the end, and that changes Renfri, because in the book, she didn't tell Geralt about Ciri and pass on peacefully. This is what happened in the book after Geralt delivered the mortal blow. She didn't cry out. Falling to her side, she dropped her sword and clutched her thigh. Blood poured through her fingers in a bright stream over her decorated belt, elk leather boots, and onto the dirty flagstones. The clamour of the swaying crowd, crammed into the streets, grew as they saw blood. Geralt put up his sword. "Don't go," she moaned, curling up in a ball. He didn't reply. "I'm cold." He said nothing. Renfri moaned again, curling up tighter as her blood flowed into the cracks between the stones. "Geralt, hold me." The Witcher remained silent. She turned her head, resting her cheek on the flagstones, and was still. A fine dagger hidden beneath the body until now slipped from her numb fingers. That is how Renfri's story ended in the book. She never had a moment of redemption. She wanted Geralt to come closer so she could stab him. The townspeople see the blood flowing in the street, and Geralt's reward is the crowd whose lives he just saved, trying to stone him. He also went against the commandment of the king, and the alderman, or his daughter in the show, asks Geralt to leave Blaviken and never come back.
You've got spunk and balls. And I like that in a woman.